None of it was regulated under any global framework. Today, however, Brussels tells exporters in India, Vietnam, or Turkey that unless their steel or cement meets Europe's climate standards, they must pay a carbon penalty at the border. The irony is hard to miss. For Washington, it raises an unavoidable question. If truly fairness matters, shouldn't those who emitted the most in the past carry the greatest share of responsibility today?
To understand Europe's new climate weapon, we need to look closely at how CBAM actually works. In October 2023, the EU launched its transitional phase. For now, importers of carbon-intensive goods, steel, cement, aluminum, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen must simply report the amount of CO2 embedded in their products. But this is only the rehearsal. Beginning in 2026, companies shipping into Europe will be required to buy CBAM certificates for every ton of emissions not already covered by a carbon price in their home country. The certificates are pegged to the price of carbon within the EU's emissions trading system, effectively forcing foreign producers to play by Brussels rules. On the surface, the logic sounds fair. Level the playing field so European companies paying for emissions are not undercut by cheaper imports from abroad. But from Washington, the picture looks more complicated. Europe is not just regulating its own market, it is exporting its climate law to the rest of the world. Countries like India or Vietnam that rely on coal-based steel production suddenly face costs they can barely absorb. Turkey, which supplies more than a third of Europe's cement imports, risks losing competitiveness entirely. The transitional phase is only the beginning. Brussels has already signaled that CBAM may expand to cover other sectors such as chemicals, polymers, and even textiles. For developing nations, that would mean an ever-widening barrier around the European market. And for the United States, it sets a precedent. Europe is using environmental policy as a trade instrument, something America cannot ignore. So while Brussels frames CBAM as climate justice, Washington sees it as climate geopolitics. The mechanism is less about cutting global emissions and more about who controls the terms of the green economy.
The first victims of Europe's carbon border are the world's emerging economies. In India, the steel industry warns that CBAM could drive prices up by more than a third. Indian production still depends heavily on coal-fired blast furnaces, which means every ton of exported steel carries a heavy carbon footprint. If Brussels enforces CBAM strictly, that cost will be passed directly onto Indian exporters, eroding their competitiveness in Europe's lucrative market. Turkey faces a similar challenge. Cement is one of the country's strongest exports to the EU, accounting for more than a third of Europe's total imports. But cement production is among the most carbon-intensive industries in the world. Meeting EU standards would require billions of dollars in carbon capture and storage investments, technology that most Turkish firms cannot afford. Without it, CBAM will raise their costs and shrink their market share. And then there is Vietnam. Each year, Vietnamese steel exports to Europe are valued at around $2.5 billion, but the country relies on coke-fired blast furnaces, one of the dirtiest methods of steelmaking. If CBAM is fully enforced, the added carbon charges could push prices up to 20 to 30%, making Vietnamese steel far less attractive to European buyers. Cement, another major Vietnamese export, is also at risk. To comply with EU rules, producers would need carbon capture systems costing billions, well beyond the reach of most firms.